In the quiet backwoods of Appalachia, the Bell family insisted they were hunted by something that spoke, touched, and tormented with purpose. Their haunting lasted years, witnessed by neighbors, and even recorded in official accounts. Some believed it was a witch, others a force older than the mountains. What exactly invaded their home remains a chilling mystery. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The Red River wound through Robertson County, Tennessee, like a promise of prosperity. Its banks thick with bottomland that produced corn tall enough to hide a man on horseback. John Bell had claimed his portion of this abundance in 1804, transforming 800 acres of wilderness into one of the county's most productive farms. His neighbors knew him as a man of rigid Baptist principles, the kind who believed that hard work and righteous living formed an unbreakable covenant with divine favor. 13 years of excellent harvests had seemed to confirm this belief. August of 1817 arrived with the oppressive heat typical of the Cumberland River Valley. The corn stood ready for harvest, the stalks heavy with ears that would feed livestock through the winter and provide enough surplus for sale in Nashville. Bell made his evening inspection of the fields on the 23rd, walking the rows as he did every night before supper, checking for signs of pest damage or disease. What he found defied every category of animal life he knew. The thing sat among the corn stalks approximately 40 yards from the tree line. Bell would later describe it to his wife Lucy as having the body of a dog, but with the head of a rabbit. Though neither description fully captured what he'd witnessed, the proportions were wrong, impossibly so. When it moved, it did not run or hop, but seemed to flow between the stalks like water finding channels. Bell, who had hunted these woods for over a decade and could identify the track of every creature from black bear to wild turkey, had never seen anything remotely similar. He raised his rifle, a flintlock he kept meticulously maintained, and fired at center mass. The shot was clean. He knew the sound of a ball striking flesh, had heard it hundreds of times. This produced that sound, but the creature did not fall. It simply melted into the corn rows, leaving no blood trail, no disturbed earth. Nothing but the acrid smell of burned powder hanging in the humid air. Bell searched until darkness made it impossible to see. He found the corn stalks where the thing had been sitting, bent and broken in a pattern that made no sense. Several stalks had been twisted into shapes that required opposing forces, as if invisible. Hands had worked the living plant into knots. He cut one of these stalks and brought it back to the house, intending to show it to his sons in daylight. By morning, the stalk had returned to its normal shape, lying straight on the kitchen table as if it had never been touched. Lucy Bell, who had borne 9 children and survived fevers, difficult births, and the countless hardships of frontier life without complaint, looked at the straight stalk and then at her husband's face. She recognized something there she had not seen before, something that made her reach across the table and grip his hand hard enough to hurt. They had been married 23 years. She knew when her husband was frightened. "Perhaps you were tired," she said. "The heat plays tricks at that hour." John Bell was not a man given to fancy or superstition. He kept careful records, attended church every Sunday, and ran his household with the methodical precision that had made his farm successful. But he also knew what he had seen, and what he had shot, and how that stalk had looked twisted into impossible angles just hours before. He said nothing more about it, but that evening he returned to the same spot in the cornfield. The twisted stalks had all straightened themselves. In their place, he found tracks, dozens of them, pressed into the soft earth between the rows. They resembled dog prints, but larger, with an extra digit that extended backward from the heel. They circled the area where he had seen the creature, then led toward the house before vanishing entirely in the middle of an open space where the ground showed no disturbance at all. The following night, the sounds began. The Bell family home was a 2-story frame structure, solidly built with lumber milled from Bell's own timber. The walls were thick, the windows fitted properly, and the doors hung true on their hinges. It was not the kind of house that creaked or settled noisily, yet at approximately 10 o'clock, as the family prepared for bed, something began scratching at the exterior walls. The sound moved with deliberate purpose, starting at the northwest corner and progressing along the wall toward the front door. Bell took his rifle and his eldest son, John Jr., and went outside. They carried lanterns and circled the house twice, examining every wall. They found nothing. No claw marks, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence that anything had touched the weathered boards. Inside, Lucy and the younger children huddled in the parlor, listening to the scratching continue its circuit of the house. When John and his son re-entered, the sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt aggressive, purposeful, as if whatever made the noise was waiting to see what they would do next. "Animals," John Jr. said, but his voice carried no conviction. He was 22 years old, strong from farm work, and generally unflappable. At that moment, standing in the parlor with his rifle clutched tight enough to whiten his knuckles, he looked like a frightened boy. For the next week, the manifestations escalated with methodical precision. The scratching became gnawing, loud enough to wake the entire household. Sounds like large rocks struck the roof, though morning inspections revealed no damage and no stones. Something began pulling at the bed covers at night, jerking them off with enough force to drag sleepers partially from their beds. Betsy Bell, 12 years old, and the youngest daughter, woke screaming one night to find her hair tangled around the bedpost in an elaborate knot that would take her mother 2 hours to carefully unwork the next morning. The girl swore she had gone to bed with her hair properly braided and tied with ribbon. The ribbon was found the next day hanging from a rafter in the barn, tied in a hangman's noose. John Bell was not a man who spoke easily of things he did not understand. His faith was practical, built on scripture memorized and applied to daily living. Demons and spirits belonged to the realm of Catholic superstition or the wild claims of frontier charlatans. Robertson County was civilized territory now, with courts and churches and proper schools. What was happening in his home had no place in this ordered world. Yet on the 9th night after he had seen the creature in his cornfield, John Bell gathered his family in the parlor and led them in prayer with an intensity that frightened even his wife. He prayed for protection, for understanding, for whatever force had invaded his home to depart and leave them in peace. His prayer was answered by the sound of heavy footsteps crossing the floor of the room directly above them. They were alone in the house. Every member of the family sat in the parlor. The room above was empty. The footsteps walked from one end of the upper hallway to the other, then back again. They stopped directly above where John Bell stood, his Bible open in his shaking hands. In the silence that followed, something laughed, a sound so alien and mocking that Betsy began to sob uncontrollably. John Bell closed his Bible and looked at his family, at their frightened faces illuminated by lamplight. He had built this house with his own hands, cleared this land, established his claim through years of backbreaking labor. He had fought in the territorial wars, survived disease and crop failures, outlasted competitors and naysayers. He would not be driven from his home by shadows and unexplained sounds. "We will not speak of this outside these walls," he said, his voice steady despite the continued footsteps above. "Whatever this is, we will endure it. We are God-fearing people, and we will not give in to panic or superstition." His family nodded their agreement, though Lucy Bell's face had gone pale as chalk, and even John Jr. could not meet his father's eyes. They had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning, that what had started as strange sightings and mysterious sounds would escalate into a 4-year ordeal that would shatter their family and make their names synonymous with one of the most documented supernatural cases in American history. That night, after the lamps were extinguished and the family had retreated to their rooms, John Bell lay awake listening to his wife's shallow breathing beside him. Through the darkness came a new sound, one that would become terribly familiar in the months ahead. A woman's voice, soft and distant, singing a hymn he recognized from church services. The voice was beautiful, crystalline in its clarity, and it came from the empty hallway outside their bedroom door. Lucy gripped his arm so tightly that he would find bruises there in the morning. Neither of them moved. They lay frozen in their bed, listening to the invisible woman sing verse after verse of amazing grace in the darkness of their home, and John Bell understood with absolute certainty that his prayer had not been answered. Whatever had come to their farm was not leaving. It had only just arrived. By October of 1817, John Bell could no longer hide his condition from the community. The affliction began with facial twitching during Sunday services, subtle at first, then progressing to violent spasms that forced him to grip the pew until his knuckles whitened. Reverend James Gunn witnessed one of these episodes and later documented it in a letter to the Presbyterian Synod, describing how Bell's face contorted as if invisible fingers were pressing into the flesh. The manifestation had chosen its primary target with calculated precision. Dr. George Hobson arrived at the Bell farm on October 14th, summoned by Lucy after her husband had spent an entire night unable to swallow. The physician found Bell in a state of extreme distress, his throat muscles contracting and relaxing without pattern or purpose. Hobson's examination notes, preserved in the Robertson County Medical Archives, describe symptoms that matched no known disease. The tongue would swell grotesquely, filling the mouth entirely, then return to normal size within minutes. The episodes followed no discernible pattern related to food, time of day, or physical activity. "I have treated men with apoplexy, consumption, and every manner of fever," Hobson told Lucy Bell privately. "This is none of those things. The symptoms appear and vanish with no medical logic." What the doctor did not say, but what his trembling hands revealed as he packed his medical bag, was that he had felt something in that room, a presence that watched his examination with hostile intelligence, waiting to see if he could help, and taking satisfaction when he could not. The attacks on John Bell escalated with methodical cruelty. During harvest season, when his supervision was most critical, the affliction would strike with particular intensity. He would attempt to give instructions to his hired hands, only to have his tongue swell mid-sentence, reducing his words to unintelligible sounds that humiliated him before men who had always respected his authority. The workers began to whisper among themselves, making signs against evil when they thought no one was watching. James Johnston, Bell's closest neighbor and a man known for his practical skepticism, came to help with the corn harvest in late October. He witnessed an episode that would later appear in his sworn testimony to the county court. Bell had been walking between the storage barn and the main house when his legs suddenly gave way. Johnston ran to help, but before he could reach his friend, Bell was jerked backward across the ground by an invisible force, his boots leaving drag marks in the dirt. The attack lasted perhaps 20 seconds, then released him abruptly. "John, what in God's name was that?" Johnston asked, helping Bell to his feet. Bell's response would become famous in the testimony that followed. "Kate," he said simply. "Kate has me." The name referenced Kate Batts, a neighbor woman with whom Bell had experienced a bitter dispute over land and enslaved people 3 years prior. The disagreement had ended with accusations of dishonest dealings and threats exchanged in public. Batts had a reputation in the community as someone not to be crossed, and whispers had followed her for years about knowledge of herbs and remedies that went beyond normal medicine. Whether the manifestation truly had any connection to Kate Batts would remain disputed. What was undeniable was that it had adopted this identity, and that John Bell believed he was being punished for something in his past dealings. The physical attacks increased in frequency and violence. Bell would wake to find his shoes filled with broken glass, his work gloves shredded by what appeared to be animal claws. During meals, food would be knocked from his fork the moment he raised it to his mouth, the incidents occurring with enough consistency that the family began to dread supper time. The invisible tormentor seemed determined to make every basic function of living an ordeal. By November, Bell had lost significant weight. His face took on a gaunt, haunted quality that made him look a decade older. The successful farmer and respected church elder was being systematically dismantled, his authority eroded, his dignity stripped away in front of his family and community. The manifestation was not simply haunting the Bell home. It was destroying John Bell specifically, with a personal hatred that suggested intimate knowledge of the man and his vulnerabilities. Lucy Bell watched her husband deteriorate with growing horror. She had married a strong man, confident in his place in the world. Now she woke each morning uncertain if he would survive another day of torment. The thing in their house was not satisfied with disturbing their sleep or frightening their children. It wanted John Bell broken, humiliated, and ultimately destroyed. And it had 3 more years to accomplish its goal. Elizabeth Bell had always been her father's favorite, a bright child with her mother's dark hair and a quick mind. At 12 years old, she helped with household duties while still finding time to run through the fields with her younger brothers. The manifestation recognized something in her that made her a target second only to her father. The attacks on Betsy began in December of 1817. Unlike the sounds and invisible assaults that plagued the rest of the family, what happened to Betsy left visible marks that could not be dismissed. The first incident occurred during breakfast when frost covered the windows. Betsy was helping her mother serve cornbread when she suddenly cried out. 3 red welts appeared across her left cheek, perfectly parallel, as if something with claws had struck her face. The marks appeared in full view of 6 family members. No one had touched her. Nothing visible had been near her. Lucy Bell examined her daughter's face, tracing the marks that were already swelling. Dr. Hobson documented them as consistent with fingernail scratches, except too deep and uniform to be self-inflicted. More disturbingly, they were cold to the touch. The attacks escalated with disturbing frequency. Betsy would be struck suddenly, with no warning, often before witnesses. Frank Miles, a family friend from Nashville, testified to watching Betsy's hair pulled upward by an invisible hand, lifting her inches off her chair. The girl screamed while Miles and John Jr. attempted to free her, pulling against a force they could feel but not see. When released, chunks of her hair remained suspended in the air before falling to the floor. The invisible tormentor seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating Betsy in front of others. During a quilting gathering at the Bell home in January of 1818, attended by several women from the church, Betsy was repeatedly slapped hard enough that the sound echoed through the room. Each strike left a bright red handprint on her face, perfectly formed, as the horrified women watched. Several fled the house and refused to return, spreading word throughout Robertson County that the Bell home was cursed. What made Betsy's suffering especially cruel was the entity's focus on her emerging social life. Joshua Gardner, a young man from a neighboring farm, had begun paying court to Betsy with her parents' approval. He was 19. From a respectable family, exactly the kind of match John Bell had hoped for his daughter. The manifestation made its opposition to this courtship violently clear. Whenever Joshua visited, the disturbances intensified. Objects would fly across the room, striking near his head. His horse would panic in the stable, requiring an hour to calm. On one occasion, documented by Joshua himself in a letter to his brother, an invisible force pushed him down the front steps of the Bell home, causing injuries that kept him bedridden for a week, but the entity saved its cruelest attacks from moments when Joshua and Betsy were together. During a church social in February, witnessed by over 30 people, Betsy's dress was violently torn at the shoulder while she stood talking with Joshua. The fabric ripped with such force that it spun her completely around. The young man reached out to steady her and immediately received what witnesses described as an invisible blow to his face that knocked him backward into a table. Betsy began to withdraw from social activities, terrified of the public humiliation that followed her everywhere. She stopped attending church gatherings and refused invitations to visit friends. The lively girl who had once delighted in company became quiet and fearful, jumping at sudden sounds and refusing to be left alone in any room. Lucy Bell watched her daughter's spirit breaking with helpless rage. She had endured the loss of children to illness, the hardships of frontier life, and now watched her husband waste away under supernatural assault. But seeing her daughter targeted, struck, and terrorized daily pushed her beyond the limits of what prayer and faith could reconcile. "Why her?" Lucy demanded of her husband one night, after Betsy had finally cried herself to sleep following another brutal attack. "She is innocent. She has done nothing." John Bell had no answer. The thing in their house operated by its own logic, pursued its own purposes. All they could do was endure and hope that somehow, eventually, it would tire of tormenting them. But Betsy's ordeal had only begun. The worst was yet to come. The whispers began in late January of 1818, so faint the Bell family thought they imagined them. Soft murmuring from the walls, indistinct syllables that could have been wind or settling timber. By February, there was no mistaking it. The thing in their house had found its voice. The progression was methodical, as if the entity was learning to speak. Initial attempts produced guttural sounds, clicks, and hisses. Then came word fragments, broken syllables echoing through empty rooms. Within 2 weeks, complete sentences emerged in a woman's voice both beautiful and terrible. The voice first spoke coherently on February 23rd, during the family's evening prayer. John Bell was reading from Psalms when a woman's voice joined his recitation, speaking the verses in perfect unison with him. The voice was cultured and educated, with none of the rough frontier accent common to Robertson County. It knew scripture as well as any minister. "Who are you?" John Jr. demanded, rising from his chair with fists clenched. "Show yourself!" The laughter that followed chilled everyone in the room. It was not human laughter, but it used human sound to express something alien and deeply mocking. "I am a spirit from everywhere," the voice replied with unsettling calm. "Heaven, hell, the earth. I am in the air, in houses, any place at any time. I have been created millions of years. That is all I will tell you." The family sat frozen as the voice continued speaking, demonstrating knowledge it should not possess. It described events from John Bell's past, private business dealings, and conversations held in confidence. It revealed secrets about neighbors, quoted from books none had read, and discussed theology with the precision of a seminary scholar. James Black, an associate of Andrew Jackson, who happened to be visiting the area that month, came to investigate in early March. A skeptical man with extensive legal training, he arrived determined to expose fraud or delusion. What he witnessed changed his position entirely and shook his fundamental beliefs. His detailed letter to Jackson described a conversation with the entity that lasted over 2 hours, covering topics from classical literature to contemporary politics. The voice displayed intelligence far beyond simple haunting or any known form of trickery. "It knows things," Black wrote with unease. "Not just facts that might be discovered through eavesdropping, but complex reasoning and analysis. It can argue scripture with the precision of a trained minister, discuss law with the skill of a barrister, and reveal private matters about people it could not possibly have observed." The voice developed multiple personalities, shifting between them with disturbing ease. Sometimes it spoke as a woman calling herself Kate. Other times it claimed to be the spirit of a Native American who had died on the land. Occasionally, it took on the character of different historical figures, speaking in accents and dialects from across Europe and America. It could maintain these personas for hours, never breaking character, demonstrating knowledge appropriate to each identity. But its favorite identity remained Kate Batts's witch, and its favorite topic remained its hatred of John Bell. "I will torment John Bell until the day he dies," the voice declared repeatedly. "He has wronged me, and he will pay for his sins. I will not rest until he is in his grave." The entity's obsession with destroying Bell became the central theme of its communications. It would describe in detail the suffering it planned to inflict, the methods it would use to break him physically and mentally. The threats were not empty. Each day brought new afflictions for Bell, and the voice took credit for every episode, explaining its techniques with clinical precision. What terrified the family most was the voice's ability to be in multiple places simultaneously. It could hold a conversation in the parlor while simultaneously throwing objects in the upstairs bedroom. It could answer questions from different family members in different rooms at the same time, maintaining separate coherent dialogues without confusion. The manifestation had evolved from mysterious sounds and physical attacks into an intelligent, articulate presence that could engage, manipulate, and torment on psychological levels the family had not imagined possible. It was no longer simply a haunting. It was an invasion by something that thought, reasoned, and hated with focused intensity. And it had made John Bell the target of its particular malice, promising his destruction with the confidence of something that had all the time in the world to accomplish its goal. By spring of 1818, the Bell Farm had become Robertson County's most discussed location. What John Bell hoped to keep private had spread with unstoppable momentum. Neighbors who witnessed the phenomena could not remain silent, and word traveled from farm to farm until nearly everyone within 20 miles knew something inexplicable was happening at the Bell property. The first organized response came from church elders. Reverend James Gunn assembled a committee of 6 men, all respected members of the Baptist congregation, to investigate and pray over the Bell home. They arrived on March 7th with Bibles, prepared to conduct what they hoped would be a decisive spiritual intervention. The entity greeted them with mockery before they crossed the threshold. Come in, men of God," the voice called from inside the house. "Let us see if your prayers are stronger than my will." What followed was documented in Gunn's private journal. The committee spent 6 hours in prayer, while the manifestation demonstrated its contempt. Objects flew across rooms, landing inches from the ministers' heads. The voice interrupted their prayers with blasphemous parodies. When Reverend Gunn attempted to bless the house, an invisible force seized the vessel from his hands and poured its contents over his head. The ministers left defeated, and their failure only increased the community's fascination. If men of God could not help the Bell family, what hope remained? James Johnston organized a different approach. He gathered 12 neighbors, all armed men who had fought in territorial conflicts, and proposed keeping nightly vigils at the Bell farm. They would work in shifts, maintaining constant presence to document the phenomena and protect the family. The vigils began in late March. Frank Miles kept detailed records of what the watchers observed. His journal entries describe phenomena that defied explanation. Objects moved across rooms with no visible means. The voice engaged multiple watchers simultaneously, demonstrating knowledge of their private lives that unsettled even skeptics. The invisible force struck the watchers themselves, leaving bruises and scratches as evidence of physical contact. The watchers noticed patterns. The manifestation was most active between sunset and midnight. It seemed to draw energy from fear, becoming more violent when observers showed distress. It had particular hatred for anyone who attempted to help John Bell, targeting those individuals for especially aggressive harassment. But the vigils also revealed the entity's limitations. It could not prevent the watchers from entering the house or force them to leave through fear alone. And despite its violent displays, it had not seriously injured anyone beyond bruises and minor wounds. This suggested boundaries to its power, though no one could determine what those boundaries might be or how to exploit them. The Bell home became a gathering place for the curious and the frightened. People traveled from Nashville and beyond to witness the phenomena firsthand. Some came as skeptics determined to expose fraud, others as believers seeking confirmation, all left with stories that added to the growing legend. The entity seemed to enjoy the attention, performing for visitors with theatrical flair. Local newspapers began publishing accounts in growing detail. The Nashville Clarion ran a series of articles in May detailing witness testimony. The Louisville Public Advertiser sent a correspondent who spent 3 nights at the Bell farm and wrote a lengthy report describing phenomena he could neither explain nor deny convincingly. The story spread beyond Tennessee, attracting widespread interest from as far as Boston and Charleston. Not everyone believed the accounts. Critics suggested mass hysteria, fraud perpetrated by the family, or collective delusion born from frontier isolation and religious fervor. But the skeptics who actually visited the Bell farm often changed their positions dramatically after direct experience with the manifestation. The community response evolved from attempts at intervention to acceptance of an ongoing crisis. Neighbors brought food to help Lucy Bell, whose household duties had become nearly impossible under constant supernatural assault. Women from the church took turns helping with washing and mending. Men assisted with farm work that John Bell could no longer manage alone. The Bell family had become a community concern, a shared burden that bound Robertson County together in ways both practical and psychological. They were no longer facing their torment in isolation, but neither could the community stop it. All they could do was witness, document, and wait to see what the entity wanted and when it might finally depart. The manifestation showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was growing stronger. Andrew Jackson's interest in the Bell Witch began with a letter from James Black, describing phenomena that defied explanation. Jackson, then a major general between military campaigns, was known for his skepticism toward supernatural claims. He had fought Creek warriors, British regulars, and political enemies with equal ferocity. The idea that some frontier family was being terrorized by an invisible entity struck him as fraud or delusion that needed exposing. In the spring of 1819, Jackson assembled a party to visit the Bell farm. The group included several military associates, a man from Kentucky who claimed expertise in dealing with supernatural manifestations, and Jackson's physician. They traveled in a wagon loaded with camping equipment, prepared to stay several days if necessary. The trouble began before they reached the Bell property. Jackson's driver noticed the problem first. The horses were straining against the harness, muscles trembling with effort, yet the wagon had stopped moving. The road was flat. The wheels turned freely when examined, but something held them fixed. The men dismounted and pushed. 6 grown men could not move the wagon forward even an inch. Jackson examined every possible mechanical explanation. The axles were sound, the wheels properly aligned, nothing obstructed their path, yet the wagon remained motionless. "It's the witch," one of the men muttered. Jackson, never a man to tolerate superstitious talk, was about to rebuke him when a woman's voice spoke from empty air. "General Jackson, how pleasant of you to visit. You may proceed now. I'll see you tonight." The voice was cultured, amused, and came from no visible source. Jackson's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, but there was nothing to shoot. The men stood frozen, scanning the surrounding woods. They found none. The horses suddenly lurched forward, pulling the wagon easily. The party continued toward the Bell farm in silence, each man processing what had occurred. Jackson's skepticism had received its first serious challenge. John Bell received them with exhausted gratitude. The farmer looked a decade older than his years, his face gaunt. Lucy Bell and the children appeared equally worn. The house showed signs of chaos. Furniture was secured with ropes, valuable items stored away, windows shuttered despite the warm weather. That evening, the manifestation performed for its visitors. Objects flew across rooms with precision suggesting intelligent control. The voice engaged Jackson in conversation, demonstrating knowledge of his military campaigns that startled him. It discussed battles he had fought, decisions he had made, details not commonly known. The Kentucky witch layer, whose confidence had impressed Jackson during their journey, announced he would rid the house of its tormentor using ancient methods passed down through generations of practitioners. He produced various powders and ritual implements, drew elaborate symbols on the floor with chalk, and began an elaborate ritual accompanied by incantations in what he claimed was an ancient and powerful language. The entity's response was immediate and brutally humiliating. An invisible force seized the man by his hair and dragged him violently across the floor. His protests turned to screams of genuine terror as something kicked him repeatedly with enough force to lift him off the ground. The beating continued for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer to those watching helplessly. When the force finally released him, the man scrambled to his feet and fled the house, collecting his belongings and disappearing into the night. "That was entertaining," the voice observed. "The general brought me a toy." Jackson's associates watched their commander's reaction with careful attention. The man who had faced down British artillery at New Orleans with legendary courage stood in the Bell parlor, his usual certainty and confidence visibly shaken. He had come to expose fraud and unmask trickery. Instead, he had witnessed phenomena that challenged everything his rational military mind told him was possible. The party remained one more night, carefully documenting what they observed with growing unease. Jackson's personal account, shared years later with close associates, described the Bell Witch as the most genuinely inexplicable and disturbing experience of his entire life. The man who would become president, who had survived duels and battles and political warfare, admitted to being genuinely frightened by something he could neither see nor fight. "I'd rather face the British at New Orleans than spend another night in that house," he reportedly told his men as they departed, leaving the Bell family to their torment. Word of Jackson's visit and retreat from the Bell farm spread rapidly throughout Tennessee. The entity's obsession with preventing Betsy Bell's marriage to Joshua Gardner intensified throughout 1820. What had begun as hostile disruptions evolved into psychological warfare designed to destroy their relationship entirely. Joshua Gardner possessed qualities that made him an ideal match. His family owned productive farmland adjacent to the Bell property. He attended church regularly, and he had proven himself capable. At 19, he represented stability. John and Lucy Bell had given their blessing, seeing in Joshua a good future for their daughter. The entity saw something else entirely. Whenever Joshua visited the Bell home, the manifestation unleashed its full torment. The voice would follow the young couple, making crude observations and predicting tragedy. Objects flew at Joshua with alarming accuracy. Invisible hands shoved him violently, once causing him to fall down the front stairs with enough force to leave him bruised for weeks. But the entity reserved its most effective cruelty for moments when Joshua and Betsy were alone. Frank Miles documented one incident where the couple attempted to walk along the Red River. The voice accompanied them with constant threats and mockery. When Joshua tried to hold Betsy's hand, something struck his arm hard enough to leave bruises. When he attempted to speak affection, the voice drowned him out with obscene parodies. Betsy endured these attacks with increasing desperation. She loved Joshua, but the constant torment was eroding her ability to maintain normal courtship. Every meeting ended in humiliation. Every tender moment was invaded by the mocking voice that seemed to know their private conversations. The entity made its position clear through repeated declarations. "Betsy Bell will never marry Joshua Gardner," it announced. "I will see them both in their graves before I allow that union." Whether the threat was genuine remained uncertain, but the psychological impact was devastating. Joshua began to fear for their safety. His visits became less frequent, not from lack of affection, but from recognition that his presence triggered the entity's worst violence. He discussed the situation with his parents, who suggested waiting until the disturbances ended. But when would they end? The manifestation showed no signs of weakening as 1821 progressed. The breaking point came in March during a walk along the Red River. Joshua had proposed they meet away from the Bell home, hoping distance might provide relief. For the first half hour, they enjoyed peace, discussing their hopes despite the ongoing crisis. Then the voice arrived, and what followed would be remembered as the worst experience of their courtship. The entity spent hours berating them, making threats of increasing severity. It described in detail the suffering it would inflict if they continued their relationship. The voice came from all directions, making escape impossible. When they attempted to return to the Bell farm, invisible forces pushed them back, trapping them while the assault continued. Betsy began to sob uncontrollably. Joshua, watching the woman he loved break down under supernatural torment he could neither prevent nor explain, felt his own resolve crumbling. They stood by the river as the sun set, trapped by an invisible force that demonstrated complete control over their movements and their future. The psychological torture continued relentlessly, breaking down their resistance with methodical precision. Every protest was met with more threats. Every attempt to leave was blocked by invisible barriers. The entity had isolated them completely, ensuring this moment would destroy whatever remained of their relationship. By the time darkness fell and they were finally released, both knew the truth they could no longer deny. When the entity finally released them as full darkness fell, Betsy turned to Joshua with tears streaming down her exhausted face. "We cannot marry," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of flowing water. "It will never allow it. It will destroy us both, and everyone we love. I cannot do this anymore, Joshua, I cannot." Joshua Gardner tried to argue, to convince her they could endure, but he saw the truth in her eyes. The entity had won. Whatever they felt for each other could not survive the constant assault on their relationship and their sanity. They ended their engagement that night beside the Red River. Joshua left Robertson County within days, accepting work on a farm in Kentucky. He never returned to Tennessee, never married, and never spoke publicly about what had happened during his courtship of Betsy Bell. The entity's voice filled the Bell home with triumphant singing for 3 days following the broken engagement. John Bell's final year began with a decline that even Dr. Hobson could not slow. Throughout 1820, the afflictions that had plagued him intensified with systematic cruelty. The facial spasms became permanent, leaving one side paralyzed. His ability to swallow deteriorated until solid food became impossible, forcing him to subsist on liquids Lucy prepared with desperate care. The entity's voice accompanied his suffering with running commentary, describing each new symptom and promising worse to come. "Old Jack Bell is failing," it would announce with obvious satisfaction. "He won't see another spring." The prediction proved accurate with disturbing precision. By November of 1820, Bell could barely leave his bed. The farm he had built now operated under his son's management, while he lay upstairs listening to life continuing without him. The entity provided constant company, its voice always present. Lucy Bell maintained vigil at her husband's bedside, watching the strong man she had married waste away. She had aged visibly during the 4 years of torment, her dark hair now gray, her face lined with exhaustion. But she refused to leave John alone with the thing that had destroyed him. On December 19th, Bell experienced a severe episode. His sons carried him downstairs, hoping a change might provide relief. He sat by the fire, unable to speak, his breathing labored. The family gathered around him, recognizing the end was approaching. That night, after being helped back to bed, John Bell slipped into unconsciousness. Dr. Hobson, summoned before dawn, could detect only the faintest pulse. The physician had no explanation for the sudden deterioration. Lucy Bell, searching for something to ease her husband's condition, opened the medicine cabinet. On the shelf sat a dark glass bottle she had never seen before. The liquid inside was nearly black, viscous, unlike any medicine in their possession. "What is this?" she asked Dr. Hobson, holding up the bottle. The physician examined it carefully, removing the cork to smell the contents. The odor was sharp, chemical, unfamiliar. I have no idea. This is not from my supplies. John Jr. took the bottle from the doctor's hands. Where did this come from? Who brought this into the house? The voice answered from the corner of the room, laughing with unmistakable triumph. I gave it to him. Old Jack won't need it now. The family stood frozen, staring at the bottle that had appeared through no human agency. The implications were terrible. Had the entity somehow poisoned John Bell? Could an invisible force actually administer a physical substance? John Jr., his face twisted with rage, opened the back door and hurled the bottle into the yard. It shattered against a rock. Moments later, the family's cat approached the spill and began licking the liquid. The animal convulsed immediately, its body seizing with violent spasms. Within seconds, it lay dead. Dr. Hobson retrieved what remained of the contents for examination, though he knew no analysis would provide answers. The substance had killed the cat almost instantly, suggesting extraordinary potency. Whether it had contributed to John Bell's condition remained unknowable, but the timing and the entity's admission created a narrative too compelling to dismiss. John Bell died the following morning, December 20th, 1820, never regaining consciousness. He was 51 years old. The death certificate listed natural causes, as no physician could document supernatural murder. The entity's reaction to Bell's death removed any doubt about its role. The voice filled the house with singing, bawdy songs, and hymns twisted into mockery, a celebration that continued through the funeral preparations. Neighbors arriving to pay respects heard the triumphant voice boasting of its victory. At John Bell's funeral, attended by over 100 people from throughout Robertson County and beyond, the manifestation maintained its aggressive presence. During the prayers offered by Reverend Gunn, it sang loudly. During the eulogy that honored Bell's life and contributions to the community, it laughed with cruel mockery. Even as they lowered the coffin into the cold December ground, the voice proclaimed its satisfaction at seeing its enemy finally defeated and buried. Lucy Bell stood at her husband's graveside, surrounded by her children and devastated by grief, and listened to the thing that had systematically destroyed their lives celebrate its triumph with unbridled joy. The entity had promised John Bell's death from the beginning, had announced its intention repeatedly over 4 years of relentless torment. Now it had delivered on that promise, and the whole community bore witness to its complete victory. The weeks following John Bell's funeral brought unexpected change to the Bell household. The manifestation's presence, which had dominated every hour for 4 years, began to diminish. The voice grew quieter, appearing less frequently. The physical disturbances gradually ceased. By February of 1821, the Bell home experienced stretches of silence that felt almost more unsettling than the torment had been. Lucy Bell moved through her house with cautious hope, afraid to acknowledge the change, as if speaking of it might summon the entity back. Her children noticed the shift as well, the absence of crashes and laughter that had punctuated their existence. Even Betsy, still recovering from the broken engagement, began to sleep through entire nights without disturbance. In early April, the voice returned with clarity and purpose. Lucy was preparing breakfast when she heard it speak her name with unexpected gentleness. "Lucy Bell, I am going now." She stopped her work, hands frozen over the flour she was measuring. "Going where?" "Away from here. My business with John Bell is finished. He lies in his grave as I promised, and I have no further interest in tormenting you. I came for him alone, and he is gone." Lucy gripped the edge of the table, years of fear making her voice shake. "Why? Why did you do this to us? What did my husband do to deserve this?" The silence stretched long enough that Lucy thought the voice had departed without answering. Then it spoke again, and for the first time, something almost like regret colored its tone. John Bell knows why. That is between him and his judgment now. I will say only that old wrongs leave long shadows, and some debts are paid in ways the living cannot accept. "Will you return?" Lucy asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "I will return to this house in 7 years, in 1828. I will visit briefly, speak with some, then depart again. After that, I will return once more, 107 years from now, in 1935. That will be my final appearance." The specificity of the prediction chilled Lucy more than vague threats ever had. The entity was not simply leaving. It was making appointments, claiming the right to return to her home at intervals it had determined. The Bell family would never be entirely free. "Why tell me this?" Lucy demanded. "Why not simply go and leave us in peace?" "Because I want you to know that I keep my promises, Lucy Bell. I promised your husband's death, and I delivered it. I promise my return, and I will deliver that as well. Remember this conversation when I appear again in 7 years." Over the next several days, the entity made similar farewells to other family members. It spoke to John Jr., offering cryptic comments about his future. It visited Betsy one final time, not to torment, but to tell her she would find happiness eventually. The conversations were brief, almost cordial, a stark contrast to years of violence. On April 21, 1821, the manifestation announced its departure to the entire household. The voice spoke from the parlor, addressing the family with what sounded like genuine farewell. "I am going, and will be gone for 7 years. Goodbye to all." What followed was described by multiple family members as the most bizarre moment in 4 years of bizarre occurrences. A sound like a cannonball rolling through the house, starting upstairs and descending with tremendous noise, though nothing visible moved. The sound progressed through each room, growing fainter, until it reached the chimney and seemed to exit. Then, silence, complete and absolute. The family sat frozen, afraid to move or speak, waiting for some trick or final assault. Minutes passed, then an hour. The silence held. No voice mocked them. No objects flew. No invisible hand struck. The thing that had defined their existence for 4 years had actually departed. Lucy Bell began to weep, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of silence. Her children gathered around her, and for the first time since August of 1817, they sat together in their home without the presence of the entity that had tormented them relentlessly. But the promise of return hung over them like a dark shadow, a constant and unsettling reminder that their ordeal might not be truly finished, only suspended. The entity had made promises before, and it had kept them all with terrifying precision. The entity kept its promise. In 1828, exactly 7 years after its departure, brief disturbances returned to the Bell home. Sounds of scratching, objects moved, and the voice spoke briefly with John Jr. and Lucy Bell. The conversations were cordial, lacking the earlier malice. The manifestation inquired about the family's well-being, made cryptic predictions, then departed after approximately 2 weeks. It left as mysteriously as it had arrived. The promised return in 1935 produced no verified manifestations, though by that time the original Bell home no longer stood. Whether the entity appeared to an empty property or chose not to return remained unknown. What transformed the Bell Witch from family tragedy into American legend was the extraordinary documentation. Unlike most paranormal claims relying on second-hand accounts, the Bell Witch case generated contemporary written records from dozens of credible witnesses. Sworn affidavits from neighbors, letters from visitors, including Jackson's associates, medical records from Dr. Hobson, and detailed diary entries created an archive historians could examine. In 1894, M.V. Ingram published An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch of Tennessee, based on extensive interviews with surviving witnesses and family documents. Richard Bell, one of John's sons, had maintained meticulous records throughout the haunting, documenting dates, witnesses, and events with precision. His journal, along with Lucy Bell's correspondence and testimony from over a dozen Robertson County citizens, provided a foundation that elevated the case beyond folklore. The case attracted attention because it defied easy dismissal. The witnesses were established farmers, physicians, ministers, and military officers, including a future president. James Johnston, Frank Miles, Reverend Gunn, and Dr. Hobson all provided detailed accounts corroborating the family's experiences. These were educated men with reputations to protect, yet they testified under oath to witnessing unexplainable phenomena. The duration also distinguished it from typical ghost stories. 4 years of sustained activity, documented across hundreds of incidents, made mass hallucination implausible. The entity demonstrated consistent intelligence, maintaining complex conversations, revealing hidden knowledge, and executing long-term plans like systematically destroying John Bell's health. Modern researchers have proposed various theories. Psychological explanations suggest collective delusion affecting an isolated community. Skeptics point to possible fraud, though dozens of outside witnesses make coordinated deception difficult to maintain before years. Some medical historians speculate John Bell suffered from a neurological condition the family interpreted supernaturally, though this fails to explain phenomena witnessed by visitors. What remains undeniable is the historical impact. The Bell Witch became embedded in American folklore, inspiring countless retellings and investigations. The case established templates for documenting paranormal claims and demonstrated how seemingly impossible events could be recorded with sufficient detail for historical analysis. Robertson County, Tennessee, preserves the Bell Witch legacy through historical markers, archives, and local traditions passed down through generations. The Red River location, where John Bell first encountered the strange creature, where Betsy and Joshua's engagement was shattered, and where the family endured 4 years of documented torment, remains part of regional identity and draws visitors from around the world seeking to understand what happened there. The Bell family scattered after the haunting ended. Betsy eventually married Richard Powell, a local schoolteacher, and moved away from Robertson County, never speaking publicly about her traumatic experiences with the entity. Lucy Bell lived until 1849, maintaining until her final days that everything reported about the manifestation was absolutely true. The children carried the story with them across Tennessee and beyond, and their descendants preserved family records that continue to fascinate researchers, historians, and paranormal investigators to this day. Whether the Bell Witch was supernatural entity, collective delusion, elaborate hoax, or something else entirely remains passionately contested among historians, skeptics, and believers. What cannot be contested or denied is that something profoundly extraordinary occurred in Robertson County between 1817 and 1821. Something documented extensively and carefully enough to survive 2 centuries of intense scrutiny, academic debate, and investigative analysis, and something that transformed one frontier family's 4 years of documented suffering into one of America's most enduring, thoroughly investigated, and hotly debated encounters with forces that defied and continue to defy rational explanation. If this story left you deeply unsettled and questioning what's truly possible in our world, hit that like button right now. Subscribe today to join our growing community of dedicated truth seekers, exploring history's darkest and most meticulously documented cases. Because some stories refuse to stay buried in the past, and the truth is often infinitely stranger and more terrifying than any fiction we could ever create.